The rain came sideways off the northern pass the night Vora rode into Thorn Pass, and by the time her horse reached the end of the main road, she had already counted the number of lit windows that had gone dark at the sight of her. 7 lanterns snuffed, one after another, as she moved down the muddy track between the storefronts and the low houses. She was used to it. She had been traveling the frontier settlements for 6 weeks in plainclothes, rough oilskin, a wide-brimmed hat soaked through, boots caked to the ankle, and the math was always the same in towns this size. The ones who lived on the edge of the northern territories had grown up on stories about orcs. Some of those stories were even true. Vora did not hold the fear against anyone. Fear was honest. It was what people did with it that told you something worth knowing. The inn at the center of Thorn Pass had a board out front that read rooms and supper, clean beds. She tied her horse at the rail and pushed through the door, dripping onto the plank floor, and the common room went quiet in the way common rooms go quiet when the thing people have been quietly afraid of walks through the door in person. The innkeeper was a stout man with a gray mustache. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he would prefer not to have. "Full up," he said. Vora looked around the empty common room. There were 3 men at a corner table, a woman reading near the fire, and 4 vacant stools at the bar. "All right," she said. She had learned not to argue. Arguing proved nothing, and she was not here to prove things. She was here to watch. She tried the rooming house at the north end of the street. The woman who answered the door looked at her face, at the tusks, at the broad gray-green shoulders barely fitting the doorframe, and said her last room had just been spoken for. The candle behind her in the hallway lit nobody. Vora nodded and walked back into the rain. That was how she ended up standing at the edge of the blacksmith's yard, reading the wet handlettering on a cedar plank nailed to the gate. E. Holt, ironwork, fair prices. The forge itself was around the back, still glowing orange through the open side wall where the man was working late, hammer rising and falling in the steady rhythm of someone who had lost track of the hour. She stood at the gate a moment, the rain hammering her hat brim. Her horse shifted under her, tired and cold. She could make her camp on the hillside above town. She had done it before. The ground would be soaked through, and the horse would spend a miserable night, and she would arrive at the next settlement with a head cold and a bad temper, which was not the state she preferred when she was trying to form measured opinions about people. She unlatched the gate. The blacksmith heard her boots on the gravel and looked up from his work. He was a man somewhere in his late 50s, broad in the chest, with forearms that told the story of 30 years at the anvil. His hair had gone mostly gray, and his face was sun-dark and plain, with the kind of lines that came from squinting into bright metal and not from unhappiness. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse that has walked into his yard, not alarmed, just attentive. "Evening," he said. "Evening?" Vora stopped at the edge of the forge light. "I'm looking for a dry place for my horse and somewhere to sleep that isn't the hillside. The inn and the rooming house are full." She said it straight, without apology or bitterness, because she had found that the plain statement of a fact asked for a plain answer in return. The blacksmith set his hammer down on the anvil and wiped his hands on his leather apron. He looked at her for a moment, at the soaked hat, the horse, the saddlebags that had the flat, purposeful weight of a traveler who knew how to pack, and then he looked at the rain, which was getting worse. "Barns around the left side," he said. "Clean straw, dry roof. Water trough fills off the eave. Horse can go in the second stall, the first one's mine." He picked his hammer back up. "I'll be in the house in an hour. If you want supper, there's a pot on the stove. Help yourself." He went back to his work. Vora stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. In 6 weeks of frontier settlements, nobody had said anything like that to her. Not the way he said it, without ceremony, without calculation, the way you'd say it to anyone who showed up cold and wet and needing a dry place. Just a set of plain facts delivered like a man reading from a list. Barn, stall, water, stove, pot of something hot. She led her horse around to the barn. It was, as promised, clean. The straw in the second stall was fresh forked, and the roof did not leak. There was a lantern hung on a nail by the door, already lit. The man must have lit it when he came in that morning and simply not bothered to extinguish it. Vora unsaddled her horse and rubbed her down and checked her hooves, and by the time she carried her gear into the corner that would serve as her bed for the night, the rain outside was hammering in earnest, and she was profoundly, quietly grateful to be inside it. She found the house by the light in the window. The back door was unlocked. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and iron and something savory that had been simmering a long time. The pot on the stove held a thick barley and root soup, and there was half a loaf of dark bread on the board beside it, and a clean bowl and spoon set out as though he had been expecting company. She ate standing at the stove, looking out the dark window at the rain, and she was halfway through her second bowl when she heard his boots on the back step. He came in, hung his apron on the peg by the door, and washed his hands at the basin without appearing to find anything unusual about the situation. He ladled himself a bowl, pulled out the chair at the kitchen table, and sat down. "Long road," he said. "6 weeks," she said. He nodded as if that answered something. "Northern Pass." "Over it, yes, and the Greystone crossing before that." He broke a piece of bread and chewed it thoughtfully. "The Greystone crossing in early autumn is miserable." "It was," she agreed. That was the whole of the conversation for a while. The fire popped. The rain pressed against the windows. The soup was better than anything she had eaten in 2 weeks. Not fancy, just made with care. The kind of cooking where someone had actually tasted it along the way and adjusted. "I can pay for the stall and the supper," she said. "No charge for a wet traveler," he said, in the tone of a man stating a policy that had been settled long ago and didn't require revisiting. She looked at him. "I'm an orc." He looked up from his bowl with a mild expression, as though she had just mentioned she was left-handed. "I noticed," he said. "Soup still hot." She did not know what to do with that exactly, so she ate the rest of her soup, and when he asked whether she took tea, she said she did, and he put the kettle on, and they sat across from each other at a plain kitchen table in a frontier blacksmith's house at the edge of the Northern Territories while the rain came down, and it was, Vora thought, one of the more quietly dignified evenings she had spent in a long while. His name was Edric Holt. She had read it on the gate. He did not ask hers that first night, which she found interesting, not rude, just unhurried, the way some people are unhurried, as if names will come out on their own when they're ready. He did not ask where she was from or where she was going either, and he did not look at her the way people sometimes looked at orcs in frontier towns, with that careful blankness that was really just held-breath wariness. He looked at her like a man looking at a guest, which was apparently what she was. She told him her name was Vora. He said his was Edric, which she already knew, and offered her more tea. She slept in the barn on the clean straw with her saddle for a pillow and her oilskin over her, and she slept better than she had in weeks. In the morning the rain had eased to a gray drizzle, and Edric Holt was already at his forge by the time she came out of the barn. She watered and fed her horse from the grain bin he had pointed to the night before. "Help yourself," and then stood for a moment in the barn doorway watching him work. He was shaping a hinge. It was a small, ordinary piece of work, the kind of thing a blacksmith made 100 times over the course of a year, and he was making it with total attention. His movements at the anvil were not showy, no flourish, no wasted motion, just the steady, unhurried focus of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that the work deserved his full respect regardless of its size. The hinge he was making was for a neighbor's gate. It did not require artistry. He was giving it artistry anyway. Vora watched that for a long moment without him noticing. There was something she had been looking for, across 6 weeks of frontier towns, and she had not been able to name it precisely until this moment. It was this: The way a person behaved when they thought no one important was watching. The innkeeper last night had been perfectly pleasant to the 3 farmers in his common room. The woman at the rooming house had presumably been kind to people she recognized. Edric Holt, alone at his forge in the early morning drizzle, was making a gate hinge as carefully as if the whole world depended on the quality of that hinge. She went back to the barn and sorted her gear. He did not mention that she should be on her way. She had said nothing about how long she intended to stay, and he seemed content to wait until she did. Around mid-morning, a young couple came to the forge to pick up a set of tools Edric had repaired, and Vora, from her position near the barn door where she was restitching a broken strap on her saddlebag, watched the whole exchange. The man had clearly been anxious about the cost. He was young, and his hands had the callous of a new farmer, someone who had come out to the frontier to make something from scratch. He asked what he owed with the careful steadiness of a person bracing for bad news. Edric told him a number that was, Vora estimated, roughly half of what the work was worth. The young farmer looked up. "That can't be right." "It's what I charge for a repair job that size," Edric said, in the same flat policy statement tone he used for everything. "You're new to the Thornpass Valley. You've got enough startup costs as it is." The young man opened his mouth, closed it, and then his wife put her hand on his arm and said thank you, and Edric handed over the tools wrapped in canvas and turned back to his work. Vora went back to her stitching. At noon, Edric came inside and made a meal of flatbread and cold roast and pickled things from a crock, and he set a second plate on the kitchen table without being asked. She sat across from him again. The drizzle had lifted. Through the window she could see the main road of Thornpass drying out in a wan autumn sun, a general goods store, a farrier's, a small chandlery, a few houses, a modest working town, the kind of place that barely merited a dot on most maps of the frontier territories. "You made that hinge this morning," she said, "for the neighbor's gate. You took more care with it than it probably needed." He thought about that. "Gate's going to be used every day for the next 30 years, he said. "Seems like it matters." She looked at him. He was eating his flatbread with the unself-conscious appetite of a man who had been working since dawn and was simply hungry. "The tools you repaired for the young farmer," she said. "You charged him less." "I charge what's fair," he said. "Fair depends on who's buying." "Most smiths don't think of it that way." He shrugged one shoulder. "Most smiths can think of it however they like. I think of it this way." She turned back to the window. On the main road, a group of children were chasing a dog through a mud puddle, and the dog was apparently winning. She watched them for a moment. "I'll stay another night," she said, "if that's no trouble." "No trouble," he said, and reached for the pickle crock. That afternoon she walked the town. She did this in every settlement she visited, a slow circuit on foot, nothing conspicuous, just looking. Thornpass was small, perhaps 200 people, maybe 300 counting the homesteads spread up into the surrounding hills. It sat at the edge of the territory where human settlement gave way to the ancestral clan grounds of the northern Orc clans, which was exactly why she was here, and exactly why she had come alone, and exactly why she had come looking like a road-worn traveler and not like what she was. The frontier line had been a fact of life for a generation. The Orc clans held the northern passes. The human settlements held the valley floors. Trade moved cautiously, in convoys, through designated crossing points, with tariffs that neither side found fair and middlemen who found them very fair indeed. It was an arrangement that had calcified out of old war and old fear, and it served no one well except the people profiting from the friction. Vora had been thinking for 2 years about whether to change it. Not through force. She had more than enough force at her disposal, and she had spent the first half of her life learning that force without understanding was just damage in a different shape. What she wanted was something harder to build and longer to last. A genuine open road. Orc traders moving freely through human towns. human goods flowing into the clan valleys, not through intermediaries or tariff gates, but simply the way people moved through places where they were not afraid of each other. For that to work, she needed to know something specific, which human settlements were capable of it. Not just willing in the abstract. She had met plenty of frontier people who were willing in the abstract, but capable of the ordinary daily version of it. Could they trade with an orc woman without making it strange? Could a blacksmith give a dry barn to a wet traveler without requiring her to be anything other than a wet traveler first? That was the question. 6 weeks of frontier towns had given her 6 weeks of data. She walked the main road of Thornpass, and what she saw was this: a general goods man who nodded to her from his doorway. The young farmer's wife from this morning, who met her eye and said good afternoon. The farrier, who was working on a horse's left hind and looked up with the distracted nod of a man whose attention is mostly on the horse. 3 children who stared at her openly in the way that children stare at anything large and unfamiliar, and then went back to their game. No doors closed, no windows went dark. She stopped at the chandlery, because one of her canteen fasteners had rusted out in the wet crossing, and she needed a replacement buckle if one was to be had. The chandler was an older man, stout, with the slow, deliberate manner of someone who had been keeping stock for many years and took quiet pleasure in knowing exactly where everything was. He did not flinch when she came through the door. He looked at the broken fastener she set on the counter, turned it over once, and went into the back room and came out with a small tin of buckles. "Brass or iron?" he said. "Iron," she said. "It's for a canteen strap." He picked out 2 that matched the size, laid them in her palm, and told her what they cost. She paid. He wrapped the second one in a scrap of cloth so she would not lose it in her saddlebag, which was a small kindness she had not asked for, and she noted it. Out on the main road again, she attached the new buckle on the bench outside the general goods store, working the leather with the small tool she kept on her belt, and 2 women passed by, and one of them said nothing and the other said good afternoon, and neither of them hurried. An old man sat on the next bench over, reading a folded paper in the way that old men read papers, thoroughly, without urgency, as though the news would wait. He looked up once, acknowledged her with the brief nod of a person confirming another person's existence, and went back to his reading. She finished the buckle and sat for a moment. In most of the frontier settlements she had passed through, there was a particular kind of performance that happened when she walked the main road. People did not necessarily close their doors or shout anything. Most of the time it was subtler than that. But there was a quality of heightened awareness that followed her down the street, the slight stiffening of posture, the careful precision of eye contact that was a fraction too neutral. People performing the behavior of people who were not afraid, which was not the same as people who were not afraid. Thornpass was not doing that. It was a small difference. She had learned to measure it. No doors closed, no windows went dark. She stood for a moment at the north end of the main road, where the track wound up into the hills and, beyond them, the northern passes. The mountains were blue-gray today under the clearing sky, and the first of the season's snow had caught on the high peaks. In 2 or 3 weeks those passes would be closed for winter. She turned around and walked back to the blacksmith's yard. Edric was finishing a set of door hinges, a matched pair this time, proper architectural hardware for someone's house. She sat on the bench outside the forge and watched him work, and he worked without needing to explain himself to her or perform for her, and she found that, for the first time in 6 weeks, she was not actively cataloging anything. She was just sitting in an autumn afternoon, watching a man do his work well. "The town's quieter than I expected for a border settlement," she said. "Most people here came to work," he said, "not to fight about the border." "That's an interesting thing to say." He looked up. "Is it? Most frontier people I've talked to have opinions about the border, about the clans." "I imagine they do," he said. He turned the hinge on the anvil and struck it twice precisely. What good does an opinion do you when you need your grain and your iron to move? She considered that. You've had goods stuck at the crossing points. Everyone here has. 2 years ago there was a tariff dispute, and the convoy route shut down for 3 months in winter. Lost half my orders for spring planting equipment because the iron couldn't get through from the eastern smelters. He lifted the hinge to the light and examined it. People who have been living on the edge of a trade war for a generation tend to get practical about it, sooner or later. Practical how? He set the hinge down and looked at her steadily. Practical like the orc clans have things we need and we have things they need, and the people getting rich off the tariff gates aren't the people doing the actual work on either side. He shrugged. I fix what people bring me. I don't ask where it came from. Vora was quiet for a moment. And yet the inn was full, she said. The innkeeper lost a brother in the eastern skirmishes 30 years ago, Edric said without judgment. He's allowed his opinion. He is, she agreed. I just don't happen to share it. She watched him go back to the hinges. The light in the forge yard was going golden, the way it did in late afternoon, and the smell of wood smoke from the neighboring houses was beginning to drift over the fence. Somewhere a few streets away, someone was baking. My horse will be fit to travel by morning, she said. All right, he said. I'll be gone before you're at the forge. I'm up early, he said. I'll have the stove lit, have some tea before you go. She looked at him. That unremarkable decency again, offered like a hinge made without ceremony, meant to last. I'll do that, she said. She went back to the barn and sat with her horse for a while in the last of the daylight, and she thought about the 6 weeks behind her and the decision she had come out here to make. And she thought about the specific quality of a man who charged a young farmer half price because the boy was just getting started, and about 7 lanterns going dark on a main road, and about the 1 yard where a gate had simply stood open. There was a thing she had been taught, long ago, by the oldest of the northern clan elders, a woman who had lived long enough to see 3 generations of war and 3 of fragile peace, and who had the particular clarity that comes from having seen things go both ways. You cannot build an open road on fear, she had said. You cannot build it on policy either, or on agreements hammered out in meeting tents by people who don't live on the road. You build it the same way you build anything that lasts, one honest action at a time, by the people who actually do the work, until there are so many honest actions that the fear doesn't have anywhere to live anymore. Edric Holt, Vora thought, had been doing his part of that work for years, probably without knowing that it had a name. She got up and went inside for supper. He had made something with smoked pork and turnips and a good deal of pepper. There was bread again. He was, she had decided, a man who took bread seriously, and a jar of dark preserves that tasted like autumn itself. They ate at the kitchen table and talked about horses, about the state of the northern road, about a frost that had come 2 weeks early this year and what that might mean for the winter. They did not talk about orcs or the border or trade agreements, and they did not need to, because they were talking about the actual world, which was the same world that all of those things lived in. After supper she asked him about the work on his board, the orders pinned up beside the forge door, the ones with dates beside them. He had a lot of work. That surprised her. You're busy, she said. I do good work, he said simply, and I don't overcharge. You could probably charge more. Probably, he agreed. I've got enough, and the people bringing me work mostly don't have extra. She thought about that for a while. There was a word in the oldest orc dialect for this quality. It did not translate exactly into the common tongue, but the nearest version was something like the generosity of the capable, meaning the particular kind of giving that comes not from having too much but from being secure enough in your own sufficiency that someone else's need feels like a natural call on your time and skill. It was considered, in the old tradition, the highest form of ordinary virtue, the kind that built lasting things. She had not expected to find it in a blacksmith's kitchen at the edge of the Northern Territories. "You've lived here long?" she asked. "Born here," he said. "My father was a smith before me, his father before that." "Your family chose the frontier." "My great-grandfather came with the second wave of settlers," he said, "back when this was nothing but scrub grass and bad weather." He smiled very slightly for the first time. "Nothing's changed." She laughed, just a short breath of it, the involuntary kind, and he looked pleased in the quiet way of someone who doesn't often produce that reaction, but is glad to have done it. She went to the barn and slept the sound sleep of someone who has made a decision. In the morning she was up before first light, as she had said. She saddled her horse and loaded her gear and checked the lashings on the saddlebags, and when she came to the back door of the house, the kitchen was lit and Edric Holt was at the stove with the kettle on, as promised. He was dressed for work, leather apron already tied, hair damp from washing, and he poured 2 cups of tea and set them on the table and sat down across from the chair that had, over 2 days, apparently become hers. She sat down. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the pre-dawn dark was very still, and the sky, through the window, had just begun to show the dark blue that comes before morning. She had not told anyone who she was in 6 weeks. She had come out here specifically to be nobody, to see the settlements through the eyes of an ordinary traveler, because she had found over the years that people showed you their real selves only when they thought you were one of them. And one of them, in the frontier valleys, meant someone without power over you. Edric Holt had shown her his real self while thinking she was nobody, which meant she had seen it. She set her cup down. "I told you my name was Vora," she said. He looked at her. "That's true," she said, "but not complete. My full name is Voronar Stonepath. The Stonepath is a title. I am the war leader of the northern clans." The kitchen was very quiet. Edric Holt looked at her with the mild, attentive expression he had used every time she said something he was taking in, the same expression he'd worn when she told him the Greystone crossing in autumn was miserable, or when she told him she would stay another night. He said. She had been prepared for a variety of responses: shock, denial, sudden nervousness, reflexive backpedaling, a rush to prove that he would have behaved the same way regardless. She had not been prepared for him. "I've been traveling the frontier settlements for 6 weeks," she said. "Alone, unannounced, without any of the markers of my office. I wanted to see what the valley towns were actually like. Whether the ordinary people living on the border were what our clan scouts reported, which is to say, mostly practical, mostly decent, mostly just trying to work and get through the winter." And he said. "And mostly yes," she said, "with exceptions." She tilted her head slightly. "Your innkeeper." "Walter lost his brother," Edric said again, in the same tone as before, not defending, just explaining the facts. "I know," she said. "The war took from a great many people on both sides." She looked down at her tea. "I was 19 when the eastern skirmishes started. I was 32 when they ended. I understand what fear looks like, and I understand where it comes from." He was quiet, listening. "What I am trying to build," she said, "is an open road. Not a managed convoy route with tariff checkpoints. A genuine open road, orc traders moving freely through human settlements, human goods and human craftspeople welcome in the clan valleys, without intermediaries or crossing fees or the particular indignity of being made to prove you are not a threat every time you move through a gate." She met his eyes. "For that to be real, it has to be built from the ground up, not from the treaty tent down. And the question I came out here to answer was whether there were enough people in the frontier settlements who were already living that way, quietly daily, without being asked, to make it possible." Edric Holt said nothing. He was looking at his tea. "Thornpass is the first settlement in 6 weeks," she said, "where not a single door closed behind me after the first night." He looked up at that. "The general goods man nodded to me," she said. "The young farmer's wife wished me good afternoon, Even the farrier managed a nod, and he had a difficult horse. She paused, and a blacksmith opened his barn to a wet traveler without asking anything of her first. Edric was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not particularly exceptional. That's just basic decency." "It should be," she said. "It isn't always, which is the entire problem." He thought about that. "The open road," he said carefully. "What would that look like in practical terms? For a town like Thornpass?" She had been waiting for that question, not the grand political question, not the fear-based question, but the practical working question, the one a man asked when he had already decided in principle and wanted to understand the details. She felt something ease in her chest. "An agreement between the Stonepath clans and the settlements on the northern frontier," she said. "A charter of passage, no tariffs, no crossing fees, no convoys required. Free movement for traders and craftspeople and travelers in both directions. Disputes settled by joint councils rather than clan arbitration or frontier courts alone." She folded her hands on the table. "The charter requires a founding settlement on the human side. A town that agrees first and publicly, so that others see it can be done." "And you're asking Thornpass," he said. "I'm asking Thornpass," she said. "Or rather, I'm telling you what I would offer, and asking whether you think the town is the kind of place that could take it." He was quiet for a long time. The kettle on the stove was just beginning to whisper again. Outside, the dark blue sky had shifted to the palest gray of early morning, and a rooster somewhere up the hill had started his opinions about it. "I'm a blacksmith," Edric said finally. "I'm not the mayor or the council. I'm not the one to accept a trade charter." "No," she agreed. "But you're the one who told me that people here have been getting practical about the trade war for a generation. And you've been here since birth. You know who I need to talk to." He thought about that. "The council meets Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she said. "That's 4 days." "It is." She looked at him. "I could come back through on Thursday, not as a traveler this time, with 2 of my officers and the charter documents properly sealed." He turned his teacup between his palms, looking at the table. She watched the calculation working in him, not fear, not excitement, but the same steady weight and balance he applied to everything. Was this solid? Was it real? Was it made to last? "The council chairman is a woman named Berta Hale," he said. "She runs the general goods store. She's been on the frontier her whole life, and she's not naive, and she's not going to agree to anything that isn't backed by something real." He looked up. "If you come Thursday, you come with something specific, not just principles." "That's fair," Vora said. "And I'll talk to her before Thursday. Not to advocate, I'll let her make her own mind up. But I'll tell her what I saw, so she's not walking in cold." "What did you see?" Vora asked. He looked at her for a long moment with those steady, deep-lined eyes. "A traveler who needed a dry barn," he said, "and ate her soup without a fuss, and asked sensible questions, and did not make anything harder than it needed to be. Something moved behind her ribs, quiet and warm, and catching her slightly off guard, the way it always did when simple truth arrived without decoration. That," she said, "is all I have ever tried to do." He nodded once, as if that also answered something. She finished her tea. She stood and took her cup to the basin and rinsed it, because she had not been raised to leave a man's cup dirty on his table, and she pulled on her oilskin and her hat and shouldered her saddlebag. At the back door she turned. "Edric," she said. He looked up from where he was still sitting, hands folded around his own cup. "Thank you for the barn," she said, "and the soup and the tea." "Safe road," he said. She went out into the early morning, and the sky was going pink over the eastern hills, and her horse tossed her head with the particular impatience of a horse who knows she is going somewhere. And Vora rode north up the track toward the high passes, feeling something she had not quite felt in 6 weeks of frontier roads, the specific relief of having found the thing you were looking for. She came back on Thursday. She came with her 2 senior officers, Hoth, who handled the legal language of clan agreements and had the sort of meticulous mind that contracts required, and old Dreva, who had been at the Stonepath side for 20 years and whose presence at any negotiation was understood in clan custom to mean that this was entirely serious. They rode into Thornpass in the early afternoon, and Vora wore the Stonepath's chain, just the chain, a broad, flat-linked thing of gray iron set with the clan's mark, nothing theatrical, and the 3 of them were large and road-traveled and unmistakable, and the town noticed. 7 lanterns did not go dark this time. Most of the main road's windows stayed lit. A few people came to their doorways. The general goods man, who would turn out to be Berta Hale's husband, which Vora had not known, came out onto his step and watched them pass with the look of a man who had received some advance information and was filing it alongside his existing worldview. Edric Holt was at the gate to his yard. He had not dressed up for the occasion, which Vora appreciated. He was in his working clothes, leather apron, forge-sooted sleeves, hair pushed back, and he looked at the 3 riders with the same mild attentiveness he applied to everything. And then he looked at Vora and gave her a short, contained nod, the kind that says, "You came back. Good. Council Hall is at the north end," he said. "Berta's expecting you." "Thank you," Vora said. "There'll be tea after," he said, "if the council takes long." She looked at him, at the flat, matter-of-fact steadiness of him, the complete absence of performance, and she thought, here is a man who opened a gate in the rain and changed the road. The council took 3 hours. Berta Hale was, as advertised, not naive. She was a tall, wiry woman in her 60s with the look of someone who had survived a great deal of frontier and formed firm opinions in the process, and she asked questions that were pointed and specific and left no room for generalities. What were the enforcement mechanisms if a human trader was mistreated in the clan valleys? What happened if an orc trader was refused service at a frontier settlement? What was the dispute resolution timeline, and who appointed the joint council members, and how were the charter's terms revised if conditions changed? Hoth answered each one. He was good at this, precise, patient, specific, never condescending. Old Dreva sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing and radiated the ancient clan authority she had been radiating at negotiating tables for 2 decades. Vora answered the questions that were not about the legal language, the questions that were, underneath their practical forms, really asking, "Do you mean this? Are you serious? Will this last?" She answered them the same way she had answered Edric's unasked questions, by being plain and specific, and not making anything harder than it needed to be. When the council broke for a short recess, Berta Hale walked past Vora's chair and paused. "Edric tells me you ate your soup without making a fuss about it," she said. "It was good soup," Vora said. Berta's mouth twitched very slightly. "It usually is," she moved on. When the council resumed, they talked for another hour about the practical implementation, how the charter would be posted, who the human-side joint council members would be, what the timeline for the first open road season would look like. The sun was low through the windows by the time Berta called for a show of hands. 7 councilors voted yes, 2 abstained, none voted against. Vora signed the charter alongside Berta Hale, with Hoth and Dreva as clan witnesses and the council secretary as the frontier witness. And when it was done, Berta rolled the document carefully and handed 1 copy to Hoth and kept the other for the council records, and said, in a voice that was composed but not small, "The Thornpass Charter, first of its kind in the Northern Territories." "First of its kind," Dreva said, in the deep and formal tone she used when she was speaking for the clan's long memory, "and worth remembering." The tea afterward was in the main room of the council hall, which was also the room where the town held its harvest suppers and its winter dances, and half the town appeared to have found reasons to drift by. The general goods man, his name was Corvin Hale, brought a plate of things from the store. Someone's wife appeared with a fruit cake. The farrier came in and stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed and eventually uncrossed them, and accepted a cup of tea from Hoth, which was, Vora thought, progress of a kind. Edric Holt came in late, still in his working clothes, with a smudge of soot on his jaw. He found Vora standing near the window and came to stand beside her with the comfortable ease of someone who does not need to recalibrate the distance between them. "How did it go?" he said. 7-2, she said, 2 abstentions. He nodded. "That's about what I expected." Walter from the inn abstained, he said. "Which is better than I might have hoped 2 years ago." He looked at his tea. "He'll come around. He's a practical man when he gets past the grief." "I know," she said. They stood together for a moment. At the far end of the room, old Dreva was engaged in a conversation with Berta Hale that appeared to be going very well, 2 women of a certain age who had both spent their lives building things, finding common ground with the efficiency of people who do not have time to waste on posturing. "What happens next?" Edric said. "We take the charter back to the High Valley and ratify it with the full clan council," Vora said. "That will take most of the winter. In spring, when the pass is open, the Stonepath clans will post the route markers for the open road. Thornpass gets the first orc trading delegation through its gates, probably by late spring, if the snow is reasonable." "That's fast," he said. "I've been waiting 2 years to move fast," she said. He made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but the closest thing to one she had yet heard from him, and she found she was smiling, which was also not something she had done with much frequency in the past 6 weeks. "The charter names a founding human," she said. "Not the council, technically, the individual whose action created the conditions for the agreement. In our tradition, that person's name is written on the first stone of the open road. It is considered a significant honor." He looked at her. "It's your name," she said, "Edric Holt. If you're willing." He was quiet for a long moment, in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than just waiting to speak. "I opened a barn door," he said. "You did," she agreed. "That's not particularly significant. Everything significant is made of things that weren't particularly significant on their own," she said. "That's rather the whole point." He looked at his tea for a moment. Then he looked out the window at the main road of Thornpass, where the lanterns were coming on in the early dark of autumn, all of them lit, the whole length of the street. "All right," he said. That was the whole of his answer. All right, the way he said everything, without ceremony, without inflation, with the quiet assurance of a man who meant what he said and had thought it through. They finished their tea. On the ride out of Thornpass, under the first stars of the evening, Hoth pulled up beside Vora and said, in the careful tone he used when he was about to say something he was uncertain about, "The blacksmith." "Yes," she said. "He'll be in the charter record, his name on the first road marker." Hoth paused. "The town will know what he did." "The town already knows what he did," Vora said. "That's why the charter passed." Hoth was quiet for a moment, thinking that through. "You knew that," he said, "before Thursday." "I had a strong suspicion," she said. "A man who charges a young farmer half price, because the boy is just starting out, is not a man whose neighbors are going to vote him down." Old Dreva, riding on her other side, made a sound of deep satisfaction, the kind she reserved for things that had gone exactly right. They rode north through the autumn dark, and the mountains ahead of them were black against a sky thick with stars, and Vora thought about the road marker that would go up in spring, a plain gray stone, orc-carved, at the first waypoint on the open road north of Thornpass, and about the name that would be cut into it, and about the unremarkable decency of a man who made gate hinges as carefully as if the whole world depended on the quality of a hinge. Perhaps it did. The winter passed. The clan council ratified the charter in early winter, at the full gathering in the High Valley, and if there were voices opposed, they were quieter than the voices in favor, which was the way of things in a council that had been watching the tariff wars erode the northern trade for a generation. Old Dreva spoke for the Thorn Pass Agreement in the formal session, and she had not lost any of her capacity for making a council chamber feel the weight of history. She did not speak long. She spoke precisely, which was the more effective method. After the formal ratification there was a meal, and at the meal there was the usual undercurrent of quiet negotiation that happened when clan leaders gathered in the same room, not hostile, just the perpetual calibration of interest and alliance that was the actual substance of clan politics. Vora moved through it and listened and said the things that needed saying, and by the end of the evening she had the commitments she had come for. 3 additional clans willing to extend the open road charter to their own territories, contingent on the first season in Thorn Pass going well. Contingent on the first season going well. That was the thing she carried back to her quarters that night, and set alongside everything else she was carrying, and turned over in the way she turned over complicated ironwork, looking for the places where the weld might fail. The snow was deep that year, and the passes were closed from early winter to late spring, and Vora spent the months in the High Valley doing the long and unglamorous work of an open road, the logistics of route marking, the drafting of the trading delegation rosters, the joint council appointments, the 1,000 small administrative things that look like nothing from the outside and are the actual substance of change. Hoth was invaluable. He had the kind of mind that found satisfaction in the precision of a well-drafted clause, and he brought to the Thorn Pass Charter the same quality that Edric Holt had brought to the gate hinge. More care than strictly required, because it was going to be used every day for the next 30 years. In those long winter months, when the work slowed in the evenings and the fire in the strategy room burned low, Vora thought sometimes about the kitchen table in Thorn Pass, and the soup, and the tea, and the particular quality of a conversation with a person who asked the right questions in the right order, and let the answers be what they were. She had not told many people who she was on that 6-week road. She had told her name to no one. And in all the frontier settlements she had passed through, only one had made her feel on the first night simply like a traveler. That was the data, and it was also something more than data, and she knew the difference. In late spring, when the passes opened, the first Stonepath trading delegation rode south. 12 traders, 6 clan guards in ceremonial kit, the marks of peace, not war, and Vora herself, which was not in the original plan but which she had decided on somewhere around midwinter and not revisited. Hoth had noted it in the delegation roster without comment. Dreva had said, in the tone she used for things that were already settled, good. They came over the last pass on a clear morning in early summer, when the mountain air was cold, and the valley below was just beginning to show its green, and Thorn Pass from above looked exactly like what it was. A small, hard-working frontier town at the edge of the Northern Territories, unremarkable in every way except that it had been first. The open road marker was already up. Edric had not put it there. The clan stonecutters had come through 2 weeks earlier to set it, according to the plan, but it stood at the north end of Thorn Pass's main road, where the track turned uphill toward the passes, and the name on it was cut in both the common script and the old Orc runes, which was the form reserved for things meant to last. Edric Holt, he opened the gate. That was all it said. That was sufficient. The delegation rode down the main road of Thorn Pass in the early morning, and the windows did not go dark. The general goods store was already open, and Corvin Hale was on his step, and he raised a hand as they passed. The farrier was at work in his yard, and he looked up and nodded and went back to his horse. Down the road, by the council hall, Berta Hale stood with the council secretary, and a couple of other people Vora recognized from the Thursday meeting, and there was something in the gathering that looked less like a welcoming committee and more like neighbors who happened to be heading to work in the same direction. Edric Holt was at his forge. Of course he was. It was a working morning and there was work to do. He looked up when the delegation came through his gate. She had not announced that she would stop, but he had left the gate open, which suggested he had expected it. And he looked at the 12 traders and the 6 guards and the clan markers and the chain at her neck, and then he looked at her, and his expression was the same one it had always been. Mild, attentive, unhurried. "Early summer," he said. "Passes are clear." "Passes are clear," she confirmed. She stepped down from her horse. "I told you I would come back." "You did," he said. She stood in the forge yard in the early summer light, and the forge was going at her back, and the town of Thornpass was going about its morning around them, and it felt, she thought, like a beginning, the plain, workmanlike kind, the kind that did not announce itself. "I'd like to show the delegation the town," she said. "Introduce them to the council, the merchants. Let them know what they're trading with." "Berta will be at the goods store by the time you get there," he said. "She opens early." "I know." She looked at him. "And after, if you've got the time, I'd take another cup of tea." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll have the kettle on by noon," he said. She went with the delegation to do the work of the morning. The introductions, the handshakes, the careful first steps of a thing that was going to need tending for years before it ran on its own. And the town of Thornpass received them with the practical, unsentimental good grace of people who had already made up their minds and moved on to the doing of it. At noon she came back to the blacksmith's yard alone. The forge was banked to a steady low heat. Edric was at the workbench inside, fitting a mortise lock, and he looked up when her shadow fell across the door and said nothing, only reached for the kettle. They sat at the kitchen table again, in the same chairs, and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and iron, and the same good bread that it had always smelled of, and the summer light came through the window in long stripes across the floorboards. "The delegation," she said, "did they seem well received?" Berta shook hands, he said. "That's the signal the whole town watches for." "She did," Vora said, firmly. "Then it'll be fine," he said. She looked out the window. In the yard, one of her guards was in conversation with the young farmer from that autumn morning, the one who had braced for a bad number, and they were apparently discussing something about tools, because the farmer was gesturing at his hands in the way people gesture when they mean a specific kind of work. "It'll take time," she said. "Most things worth building do," he said. She turned back to him. He was looking at his tea with the same thoughtful expression he brought to a piece of ironwork, not worried, just attending to it. "I'll come through here again," she said, "when the trading season closes in autumn, to review how the first season went for the charter record." "I imagine the council will want a full accounting," he said. "They will," she paused, and the tea was good. He looked up from his cup, and there was something in his expression that was quiet and warm and entirely contained, the same quality he brought to everything he made more care than was strictly required, because it was going to be used every day. "Come in autumn, then," he said. Outside, her guard and the young farmer had moved on from whatever tool discussion had engaged them, and were now apparently trying to decide something together, because the farmer was pointing toward the forge and the guard was looking interested, and in the easy, unhurried way of a morning in early summer on the first day of an open road, something small and practical and lasting was beginning. Vora watched it through the window and drank her tea, and felt, for the first time in a very long while, that the world was exactly the size it was supposed to be.